Hello, Section 7. It's Mrs. Wallace. I'm sorry to not be in your class again today. I know everybody's been working hard on their HIs, and I'm really sorry. I was on the Model UN trip, and then today my husband had an unexpected medical procedure, and I need to be there. So I'm doing this video for you. This is a little bit about the Islamic Empire's beginnings, as well as the religion of Islam. You did read a little bit last time you had history, I hope, so that way you have a little bit of a sense of some of the content that we'll address in the beginning. But I will make sure tomorrow in class to give you a note sheet that has everything that's on the slide. So that way, you have some of the notes, okay? So a few things. First of all, we are going to be looking at the time period of the early 600s and the role of Muhammad and some of the revelations. Muslims believe that Muhammad will receive revelations from Allah, and this happens over the course of about nearly 2 decades. And so Muhammad is somebody who lives in the early 600s. Even prior to Muhammad and prior to the beginnings of Islam, the Arabian Peninsula has really distinct cultural groups. So we're going to note a little bit about the culture because this tells us a little bit about the society that Muhammad would have been in the time period of the early 600s. We describe the group of people as the Bedouin. The Bedouin were a group of people that largely organized themselves in tribes and clans. So we have like nomadic groups that are based on the economic activity of herding animals, maybe the selling of milk, maybe using some of those animals for a variety of purposes, but selling goods. So participating in commercial economy, but also largely spending the day herding animals. And tribes and clans suggest that groups were organized by kinship relationships rather than by some other social hierarchy. And this is also a society that doesn't have, its organization is not necessarily with many, like a multitude of a whole bunch of cities and regional kingdoms. This is largely tribal groups that sometimes are competing for resources, sometimes cooperating. So there's conflict, there's cooperation between tribal groups, and the tribal groups are quite large and organized in a hierarchy within each tribal group, oftentimes by kinship relationships. The Arabian Peninsula, first of all, is massive. It's huge, and geography becomes really important in this particular part of the world. There is a small amount of fertile land which can grow agricultural goods, and there are some places where there's available water. So where people live and where people don't live becomes really significant in the geography, and the Bedouin become very involved in navigating around this geographic space, okay? Each Bedouin tribe is autonomous, like they do their own thing. It's almost like their own, kind of political system. And they do, again, conflict. And some of these conflicts continue even though the society largely will transition to embrace Islam. And that becomes a very unifying aspect of culture when Islam is introduced. But some of these tribal divisions are consistent groups of people, and how they're organized. It's sometimes hard to break some of those tribal groups. In pre-Islamic times, this group of Bedouin, which would be Arabic speaking, were polytheistic. So they had polytheistic religious practices. And it's important to note that they may have varied. So in the area of Mecca, for example, there may have been religious pilgrimages, or people in the community may have come to the Kaaba even to pray for a variety of different religious spirits. Some of this is, it's important to mention rather that this is before Islam. As soon as we see the introduction of Islam, polytheism will no longer be for individuals, who have converted to Islam. It becomes much more unified around the pillars of Islam, and polytheism. So, for example, where it was practiced at the Kaaba, becomes something that doesn't occur. Okay, Christians and Jews also live in the region. So, an important bit of context is that there are monotheistic groups in terms of religious practices. So, while the Bedouin might be polytheistic, and there's a variety of different gods that are worshipped, there's also monotheists. Christians and Jews both believe in one God, and so there's some aspect of that. Muhammad, for example, would have known about Christianity, would have known about Judaism, was exposed to that religion just living in this region. If we look at the image that you see on the screen, this is the Kaaba. It is existent today as the location for the Hajj. One of the 5 pillars of Islam is to go on the pilgrimage of Hajj during one's lifetime. And the Kaaba has so very significant importance today. What we're seeing, and it's in modern day Mecca and modern day Saudi Arabia, to go on Hajj, one has to be Muslim. So it's actually it's a sacred space that's hard to access. If you're not Muslim, it's impossible to access. And to travel to Hajj means kind of working with a very specific travel agency and, papers that are going to go to, the planners and government in Saudi Arabia. So there's a great deal of ways in which people prepare for Hajj, but you can see the number of people who are walking around the Kaaba. That's one of the traditions within the Kaaba. The Kaaba is this cubic shape that we see in the middle. It's covered with a black curtain, but it's like kind of a building, that brick building you can see underneath the curtain. People do not go inside the Kaaba, but there is a black stone that people try to kiss. There is a effort. Basically, people are walking around the Kaaba to get closer to the Kaaba. People also walk in certain clothing. So people are wearing clothing that's rather uniform. So Muslims all around the world gather in this pilgrimage without kind of the sense of status going on within the group. It's very much, Muslim, 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 with everyone kind of wearing similar clothing regardless of where they're at. The Kaaba, Muslims would believe, is something that predates the religion itself. It is seen to apply to a story that's also a common story in Judaism and Christianity. If you've ever heard the story about Abraham, who is asked by God to sacrifice his son Isaac, the Kaaba relates to that particular story. Ultimately, Abraham is tested, and he doesn't sacrifice. He does say he will sacrifice his son, but then ultimately doesn't have to because he kind of passes the test that he has submitted to God. The Kaaba is based on a similar story with Abraham, his wife Hagar, and his son Ishmael. So the story is related, a little bit different, but the Kaaba is believed to have been built in the time of Abraham and by Abraham. So it has significance as an ancient site also. It also has significance in Islam because Muhammad, during his lifetime, will claim the Kaaba for Islam, which is where its significance in terms of a pilgrimage today. And of course, when Muslims pray, they pray toward this site every day. What we know about Muhammad, and this comes from a variety of sources. So we're kind of using some historical sources. Also, Muslims might read about the life of Muhammad in texts that are about his life, like the Hadith. The Quran, for example, is not about the life of Muhammad. It has other types of information. It is not about, it's not a narrative that you read from, page 1 to 100 or anything like that and get a story about somebody's life. It's not like that at all. Much more descriptions in terms of even legal codes or other types of phrases. Very, very different. There's long and short parts of the Quran. But what we know about Muhammad, born in Mecca to a merchant family, very, very much Mecca is a city at this time. So there are cities, and Mecca is a large city, but it is very focused on merchant activity and commercial activity. People do come to the Kaaba for pilgrimage during the lifetime of Muhammad. He's orphaned at a young age. He's actually raised by an uncle. And so this is like part of his, lived experience that's kind of unique. He does not apparently receive a great deal of formal schooling and starts to work in the caravan trade. He does get married to a wealthy widow who is older than him by the name of Khadijah. And they are married for some time, have many children. Polygamy, which is marrying a man marrying multiple women, is actually common in this society as it is in many in the Middle Ages. But we see Muhammad, I think after the death of Khadijah, he might take on additional wives. Apparently, Muhammad was somebody who was growing very troubled with the increase in commercial activity that was happening around the Kaaba and some of the center of the city. He thought that people were being taken advantage of and exploited, that there was lots of dishonesty. People were being sold, goods and not being treated fairly. And so the Bedouin, which had values very much of honesty, there's also a value of storytelling and kind of oral history and poetry, even like poetry slams by the fire, things like that would be popular among the Bedouin. And Muhammad starts to isolate himself from the society. He becomes that individual who is like a little bit of the social critic of his time, not necessarily happy with the values that he's seeing, and starts to talk about that. And in this meditation, Muslims would believe that Muhammad is said to have heard the voice of the angel Gabriel, and he is told that he is the messenger of Allah. He ultimately says that, he is not able to be the messenger because he is not lettered, meaning he's not literate, but he hears the revelations and is able to remember them. So a lot of the tellings of the words of Allah come from Muhammad repeating them to other people, and this becomes ultimately what's in the Quran. So Muslims would see the Quran as the words of Allah. Muhammad describes himself as the last of the prophets. So something that's important about the Quran is that there are many different prophets who might be mentioned, prophets that are even familiar in Christianity or Judaism. So Muslims might recognize Moses or Abraham or Jesus Christ as prophets. That doesn't necessarily mean that Muslims, will worship Jesus Christ or see Jesus Christ as a Messiah like Christians might. Very, very different. But Jesus is an earlier prophet, like Muhammad is a prophet. But Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. He's seen as the last of the prophets, so no prophets after Muhammad. These revelations, according to the tradition, continue for about 22 years, okay? The preaching in about 613 is what Muhammad begins, and initially he has some followers, family and friends, but there's also people that resist his message. Some people are very afraid of monotheism. It's a polytheistic community. Many people are also concerned that, this kind of angst toward commercial activity is problematic, and that might stop some of it. So he is not somebody who's welcomed in Mecca. In 622, he and his supporters go to a city called Yathrib. It later becomes Medina, known as the city of the Prophet, and it is north of Mecca. And this becomes significant. It is called the Hijra. This is notably different than Hajj. Hajj is the pilgrimage. Hijra is the flight or migration of 622 that Muhammad makes with his followers. He will stay in Medina for some time, and some historians say he was invited to Medina to resolve some conflicts. Certainly he's kind of pushed out of Mecca, but this year of 622 marks the first date on the official calendar of Islam. So even in this time period, if you were following an Islamic calendar, we would have totally different years on it because everything would be dated instead of CE, it would be AH after the Hijra. So, everything is how many years after the Hijra. Okay, so 622 is like year one in the calendar. It's a lunar calendar, so we can't just add 622 to everything. Also, at Medina, the Islamic community will grow. So Muhammad wins support from some of the city, the Bedouins in the countryside, and he forms what is really described as the first Muslim community. Sometimes this is referred to as the umma, ultimately Dar al-Islam, the entire community of believers. By 630, he will head back to Mecca. Some of this may involve some initial conflict, but ultimately marches into Mecca, where he takes back the city. Muhammad is seen at this point as a political leader, military leader, and a religious leader. That authority is kind of combined in one individual at this point, and a good number of people now in Mecca and the followers that came to Mecca are going to be following the religion of Islam. And it's at this time that Muhammad declares the Kaaba a sacred shrine, will order the destruction of all the idols of other faiths or any polytheistic idols, and the Quran will